Macquarie University. And first, I really want to, and especially this week, it's NAIDOC week, I want to really acknowledge the traditional custodian of the Macquarie University land, the Watamaga clan of the Daro Nation, whose cultures and customers have nurtured and continue to nurture this land since the dream time. And we sincerely pay our respects to elders past, present, and future. So before we start our today's very exciting IPBES-IPCC report briefing, let me just allow me 1 minute to introduce you a bit about our Center for Environmental Law here at Macquarie University. And we are the oldest Center for Environmental Law in Australia, established in 1983, if not the oldest in the Southern Hemisphere. And we are also a very new center with new blood coming in every year. And we are very lucky here as a center that every year we select a cohort of high quality final year undergrad and also postgrad students to help us. So without their assistance here, I particularly thank Gabriel Clark, Sarah Wonderfield, Tammy, and also our lovely social media team, because this event will be live tweet on our Twitter account for those who can't follow our live event. This Shala, Andrew, and Micah. So without their support, we won't have a kind of an event like this today. All right, so today's event is going to be chaired by our very own Professor Leslie Hill. Leslie sits on our advisory board, and she is a distinguished professor of biology and also our Pro-Vice Chancellor at Macquarie University. And we deliberately invited her to chair today's panel because she has been researching the impact of climate change on species and ecosystems for more than 20 years now. And she's a former lead author in the IPCC's 4th and 5th assessment report, and also a former federal climate commissioner, and now a counselor with the Climate Council of Australia. And she's also in a member of the Wentworth group of the concerned scientists and a director of WWF Australia. Without further introducing our panelists, because Leslie will do so, and so now I will just hand over to Leslie for you to chair today's panel. Thanks once again, everyone, for attending our event today. The floor is yours, Leslie.
Thanks, Yingyi, and good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for joining this special event. So today we are briefing you about the first ever collaborative report from the Intergovernmental Science Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, otherwise known as IPBES, and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. I want to begin by also acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I sit, which is the Wallumattagal people of the Darug Nation. So let me begin by now introducing our 3 distinguished panelists. So firstly, we have distinguished Professor Xu Meibai from the Australian National University. She's a professor of urban environment and human ecology in the Fenner School. We have Dr. Ram Pandit, senior lecturer at the School of Agriculture and Environment at the University of Western Australia, and Dr. Michelle Lim, senior lecturer in the Centre for Environmental Law here at Macquarie University. All 3 of our panelists are authors on this report, so they'll be speaking to the content of the report from their own very recent experience. I've got a series of questions to pose to our panelists, but as I go through, I'd encourage you to put any questions into the chat box. And if we have some time at the end, I'll try to get to as many of those questions as possible. Just for my sake, because I'm going to be multitasking, please make the questions short and sharp rather than extensive essays, because otherwise I'm just going to lose control of the whole proceedings. So let me begin with a question firstly to Michelle. IPBES and IPCC are acronyms that a lot of people have heard of, but perhaps they don't really know what they mean. Can you explain a little bit about these 2 bodies, how they came to do this report, and kind of a little bit about how the report was put together?
Thanks, Leslie. And that's a very polite way of saying, make sense of this alphabet soup. And as you will see, whenever anyone has to tell us what the acronym of either IPBES or the IPCC is, we kind of draw breath. And Leslie has already very nicely articulated what each of the letters of each of the names are. But essentially, what do these two bodies do? The IPCC, almost as old as I am, established in 1988, is the key UN body that synthesizes the literature around climate change. IPBES, on the other hand, a much newer body, does a very similar thing, even though it has other functions such as capacity building, but very similar things, synthesizing the literature as it relates to biodiversity and nature's contributions to people. So there's extensive literature, including papers which say IPBES is not the IPCC, which talk about the differences between the two bodies. But I think for current purposes, what they both do in common is the key interest that we have in them today. So synthesizing the literature is one of the main tasks of both of these bodies. And importantly, the same I that you see at the start of both names is this idea of them being intergovernmental bodies. So it's not just researchers, scientists, social scientists talking about what's in the literature, but importantly, that communication into science, into that science policy interface. So many of you will be familiar with the main outcomes of both IPBES and the IPCC, and that comes in the form of assessments. And assessments are these huge tasks, often over 3 years, usually involving 400 to 500 scientists and social scientists from around the world. But what we have today is the first, what we're talking about today is the first ever collaboration between these two bodies, IPBES and IPCC. And this collaboration comes in the form of a workshop report rather than an assessment. So a workshop report is slightly different in that it's quicker, but doesn't go through that same more rigorous process of assessments. And originally, we were all going to, 50 authors from 25 from IPBES, 25 from the IPCC, were originally going to meet in May last year in the UK. But then for reasons which I'm sure we all understand, that didn't happen. So it kept getting postponed. Eventually, in December last year, it was an online workshop involving a range of authors. And importantly, the reason why this workshop report came about is to feed into some of the really important negotiation processes that are occurring this year, including hopefully in October, the post-2020 framework of the Convention on Biological Diversity, but also the Conference of the Parties to the UNFCCC, the Climate Change Convention, also at the end of this year. So the first time ever, even though there's been this huge understanding for a long time that the climate change and biodiversity communities need to work closer together, this is the first time that these two global bodies of this research have come together to put together the report we're just about to talk about.
Thanks very much, Michelle. I think everybody can appreciate the level of organisation that must have gone behind the scenes in order to make that all happen. So Shumei, I'm going to go to you now with what is possibly the most difficult question, is can you encapsulate for our audience the key messages that have come out of this report? You're on mute, I'm afraid.
Okay, thank you, Leslie. I'll try. So there are many messages that are highlighted by this report, but here I think I'll just pick up 3. The first one is that the report really stresses that the climate change and biodiversity are the 2 greatest challenges facing humanity and the planet. And this probably is not news to many of you because human-induced climate change is really increasingly threatening nature and its contribution to people, while the greenhouse gas emission, which is the cause of the climate change, has been really ever increasing. So the IPBES global assessment, which was published in 2019, made a big splash at that time in global media, which shows that the human pressure on biodiversity is increasing and the loss of biodiversity is at unprecedented rate. 1 million species of plants and animals risk extinction within a matter of decades. So this million species of extinction has really made headline at that time. And this IPBES and IPCC report also show that while having some pocket of success, the conservation efforts that we have been putting in have not really been sufficient to stem the loss of biodiversity on a global scale. And the second message is that what this report is really trying to highlight is that climate change and biodiversity really need to be tackled concurrently, or else it will risk perverse outcomes. So climate change exacerbates the risks to biodiversity and natural and managed habitats loss. And at the same time, the natural and managed ecosystems and their biodiversity really play a key role in the fluxes of greenhouse gases, as well as in supporting climate change adaptation. But the report really stresses that previous policies have really largely tackled the problems of climate change and biodiversity loss independently. And the report concludes that policies that simultaneously address synergies between mitigating biodiversity loss and climate change, while also considering their social impact, offers the opportunity to maximize co-benefit and help meet development aspirations for all. So the third point is really coming from the societal impact phrase from the previous point. And I really like to highlight the report isn't just suggesting that we look at climate change and biodiversity concurrently, but it also very strongly emphasizes that we cannot do the above two without human well-being and issues of justice and equity really being at the center of the attention. Because not only the climate and biodiversity are inextricably connected with each other, they're also closely connected with human futures. The IPBES conceptual framework, which is nature's contribution to people, really highlighted the various ways of how biodiversity and ecosystem can benefit human well-being. And the series of IPCC reports so far have shown that the impact of climate change on human well-being is evident. Just look at the record-breaking extreme heat in Canada last week and the associated human casualties. And living in Australia, we all have experienced the extreme drought and the devastating wildfire and flood and so on and so forth. So on the other hand, the pursuit of this good quality of life can also be a key driver exacerbating the climate change and biodiversity loss. And it is really important to note that the drivers, benefits and impacts are not evenly distributed, and nor the three layers they match spatially. So very often the most vulnerable population have contributed the least to the drivers, but they suffer the most from the impacts. So really finding a just and equitable way forward will be critical in addressing climate change and biodiversity concurrently. So really in summary, the report finds that treating climate, biodiversity and human society as really a coupled system is key to successful outcomes. So in order to be successful, the conservation and climate change actions would really go hand in hand across landscape and in cities as well as in rural areas. So for the moment, I will stop there.
Thanks very much, Yimei. That was very comprehensive. I'm going to go to Ram now. So Ram, you worked on the section of the report dealing with how biodiversity actions affect climate. And we hear a lot in the press about nature-based solutions. Could you tell us a bit about your section of the report and how biodiversity can be used really to help solve the climate problem? You're on mute.
Let me unmute. Yeah. Thank you, Leslie, for this question. Yes, I worked on that particular section where how biodiversity conservation related activities could benefit mitigating climate change or adapting to climate change, and ultimately, to some extent, helping to human well-being. As we know from previous speakers already, nature is severely being impacted by climate change. When I say nature, biodiversity is the fundamental building block of nature. When nature is being degraded due to human actions or other reasons, that will directly impact human well-being through different benefits that we derive from nature. So nature is being severely impacted. If you look at the IPBES Global Assessment Report or the World Economic Forum Outlook, so we are starting to see that climate change is going to be the significant, one of the top 5 already, and perhaps going to be the key reasons of biodiversity loss. So in order to reverse this, what can we do? I mentioned, or I referred to some of the points already mentioned by earlier speakers. So we need to deal with climate change in order to maintain nature and nature's benefit to people. This nature's benefit to people is the framing that IPBES has used to refer to ecosystem services in general. So just to make sure we understand the terms here. Then nature, on the other hand, plays a fundamental role as a carbon sink in order to address the climate change problem. Whether we look at the plants or land or soil or ocean systems, so nature can act as a carbon sink to address the climate change problems. But oftentimes, what we found in the report is that it's not only the forest that is acting as a carbon sink, but other systems, for example, grasslands or peatlands and mangrove in particular, they're quite important ecosystems in order to address the climate change problem. As an example, coral and marine system, which are still overlooked in order to address the climate change problem. But if you see the impact of this system, then mangrove alone can sequester 4 times more carbon per unit area than the Amazonian rainforest, for example. So we see that sort of linkage between biodiversity loss and how biodiversity conservation or nature conservation can contribute to climate change mitigation. But all of these have a link to human well-being. I don't want to repeat the same example that Jumi has given, how changing climate is affecting our health system in some sense, the increased heat and heat island effect in areas where we never observed that sort of heat in the past, and the human suffering as a result of that. Being in Australia, we understand the impact of extended drought, the extreme heat and wildfire, and how it is affecting our agricultural systems as well as the other systems. So these 3 issues, biodiversity loss, climate change, and human well-being are very much interlinked, and we need to look at simultaneously how we can maximize the synergies in dealing with these issues while minimizing the trade-offs that can emerge from addressing these issues. That's what we looked at in our section.
Okay, thanks very much, Ram. Jumei, I'm going to come back to you now, because we know that as humans adapt to our own changing circumstances, not all of the things that we do to adapt have good outcomes for biodiversity, and in fact, quite the opposite in many instances. The report deals with this problem. Can you give us some examples from the report of how human adaptation can actually be an additional problem from biodiversity over and above the direct impacts of climate change?
Certainly, I can highlight a couple of examples from the report. For example, biofuel is considered as a key source of renewable energy, but producing this biofuel at scale really requires planting, bioenergy crops in monoculture sort of way over a very large share of land area. And this land requirement, they might come from, several different ways. For example, a direct land use change by converting the rainforest, peatland, savanna, or grassland, or indirect land use change by converting the current cropland for food production into energy crop, which actually creates pressure to convert the natural land into cropland elsewhere. So both of these land use change, either direct or indirect, they can also result in a large amount of carbon emission, actually, and they're also found to pose threats to biodiversity. And from our own research looking at urbanization and food security, we know that there are already strains between different types of policy goals, for example, such as trying to protect agricultural land laws for food security, and also securing land for urban habitat and infrastructure construction in order to accommodate the increasing urban population in the world, and preserving some of the land for natural ecosystems so that we can actually benefit from the many ecosystem services that these ecosystems actually provide. So this is one example of trade-offs. And another one is afforestation, which is aiming at increasing the carbon sink, and which is receiving lots of attention in terms of climate change mitigation. But this can also have a detrimental impact if not done properly, because planting trees in ecosystems that have not historically been forest, and reforestation, with this monocultural sort of manner, especially with exotic tree species, they have detrimental impact on biodiversity. And also we know that some renewable energy production generates surges of mining activities in land or ocean. For example, the mining for rare and critical metals in order to produce batteries, they can have serious detrimental impact on biodiversity and ecosystems. So the report also shows that technical measures which are too narrowly focused on adaptation, such as building big dams or seawalls in order to prevent the climate impact, they can have significant impacts on the flora and fauna of the site. But having highlighted all these climate measures that have negative impact, I would also like to say, of course, we shouldn't forget that many of the climate actions actually do have positive impact on biodiversity. For example, like the blue carbon sequestration in coastal area actually can help restore the degraded mangrove ecosystems. And another major thing is the dietary change to a less meat intensive sort of diet structure, or reducing the food waste can help achieve sustainable fisheries and sustainable agriculture, and also reduce the demand for increasing agricultural land, and make the risk of increased protected area, the task of increasing the protected area a bit more achievable. And sustainable agriculture and forestry practice, in turn, they can really improve adaptive capacity of the local community, enhance the biodiversity, and also increase the carbon storage in farmland and forest soils and vegetation, and reduce greenhouse gas emission. So I guess the challenge is really trying to identify the area of co-beneficial synergies, and try to manage the areas that have trade-offs between those two, and really try to avoid those with co-detrimental outcomes. And if you look at the report, there are examples of all these three different areas. Probably I don't have time to go into details, so I'll stop here.
Thanks very much, Shumei. I'm about to revise my lectures on this topic for next semester, so the report has come at a perfect time for me. Could I remind our audience that we will be trying to take some questions at the end of the panelists' questions. They are starting to come into the chat box, but if you have any questions for our panel, please start putting them into the chat now. Okay, so Michelle, coming back to you. So from you're a lawyer. One of the things the report does is that it identifies the siloed nature of the legal and policy approaches to climate change and to biodiversity, both together and separately, as an issue. Can you expand on how the report kind of unpacks that issue and perhaps recommends some ways forward on it?
Yeah, so very much building on what Shumei has just said in terms of this need for coupled systems approaches, so approaches which recognize how closely intertwined not only every part of the biophysical system is, but how closely it's linked to human well-being and human outcomes. At the same time, talking about the need for legal and regulatory frameworks that work across these range of scales, from cities to state to national to international. But the legal system deals with this quite badly. So even very basic things, if you look at some of the Rio conventions, such as the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Convention on Biological Diversity, in many ways, they were born at the same place in Rio, in part of the Rio conference, and yet the level of climate biodiversity cross-references across these conventions, it's almost hardly there. So Paul Gavin's here today. We're doing work which highlights the limitations of the cross-references across these frameworks, not only in the original convention text, but even in the years since, where you've got the Paris Agreement, you've got the Aichi targets in the Convention on Biological Diversity, and also now, hopefully soon, the post-2020 framework. The level in which those interconnections between even just climate and biodiversity, are the level in which it's recognized is very, very basic, hardly at all. Increasingly, it is done in that way, but then even things such as terrestrial ecosystems and oceans treated quite siloed. So we know that ocean acidification is a huge issue linked both to climate change and the health of marine ecosystems. And yet it falls into almost this huge gap. Oh, you've got the Law of the Sea Convention on the one hand, you've got the Climate Change Convention on the other. They're kind of almost looking at each other going, oh no, neither of them are dealing with it. So these huge gaps in our legal systems. Some of you might be thinking, oh, wait, what about the Sustainable Development Goals? Don't they, Ban Ki-moon said that we were going to address the key drivers of climate change. We were going to address poverty by 2030. We don't have that far to go. Don't the Sustainable Development Goals deal with all these issues together? They look like they do on paper, but really, when you look at the goals themselves, they follow that very siloed architecture of the existing international law framework. So for example, even fresh water is dealt with separately in its, fresh water running in rivers sense versus fresh water for human consumption sense. You've got the oceans dealt with in a separate goal to how biodiversity occurs in ecosystems. So these, I suppose you would say, a huge areas for improvement in terms of our regulatory system. So some of the key recommendations that come through in the report is taking more integrated approaches across each of these issues, but importantly also a transnational approach to regulation, one that deals with the actors across those range of scales, whether it be communities, cities, states in the traditional sense of international law, but joining things up not only across sectors, but importantly across scales as well. So thinking innovatively about how we might do that.
Thanks, Michelle. I'll come back to Ram now. So earlier you touched on this, but I'll draw it out a bit more. We hear a lot about nature being able to be used as a carbon sink. Can you touch on both the advantages of that and, well, at least in my view, sometimes an over-optimistic view of nature being the antidote for everything, every atom of carbon dioxide that goes into the atmosphere. Tell us a bit about how nature can be used as a carbon sink, but also what the limitations are.
Okay, thank you. This is something which I guess I need to connect to your earlier question about nature as a solution to the environmental problem. If we look at from climate change mitigation or adaptation point of view, nature acts as a carbon sink. Whether it is soil or land or ocean, there are potentials to mitigate carbon through these systems. If we look at anthropogenic carbon emission, the report highlights that around 55 gigaton of carbon dioxide equivalent per year is being released. And if you look at these systems, then land-based systems can mitigate around 30% of this, whereas the ocean system can mitigate additional 20 to 25% of this. So through proper management of ocean and land-based systems, we can mitigate the climate change impacts, or we can reduce the impacts. But at the same time, we also need to enhance the biodiversity through proper management of this. So that's where perhaps your second question about the limitation comes in. If it is just about addressing climate change problem, then we can have a monoculture plantation, for example, but it has a significant trade-off on biodiversity outcomes. So there are some limitations in terms of how do we manage these land-based or ocean-based systems in terms of addressing climate change problem, whereas enhancing biodiversity. So thinking through the silo approach, as Michelle mentioned earlier, may not work going forward, given these two are significant environmental challenges we are facing. So in terms of, as an example, in terms of managing ocean system or fisheries can be one of the example where if we use some way of harvesting fish in the current system, for example, using trawl, and if we change it, there is a significant benefit of sequestering carbon. So there are ways, how do we do things by which we can minimize the limitation that can come along with managing ocean system or land-based system at present, whereas enhancing the synergies. In the land-based system, the other thing is it's not only sequestration, but carbon fluxes through the system will release carbon into the atmosphere. So we need to be smart in terms of managing our land-based system as well through albedo effect or some other forms. So those are some of the things we have to be mindful in terms of thinking, how do we manage these twin environmental challenges to maximize the benefits to the society? I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Ram. I'm going to pose a question now to all three panelists in that the reports like this are always very good at identifying problems. This report, I think, also goes a long way towards identifying solutions, but I'd like to ask each of you to summarize from your perspective and your expertise what the most important ways forward and recommendations are from the report in the solution space. So perhaps I'll continue on with Ram first and then go to Michelle, then Shumei. So Ram, the most important solutions and ways forward.
Well, given the discussion we are having and what the report has highlighted, we need to look at these three issues: two environmental issues, climate change, biodiversity loss, and the societal concern of improving our well-being together. So the first thing I would say is protecting and restoring carbon and biodiversity-rich ecosystem is the first priority. It will fulfill addressing those twin environmental challenges. Then this idea of nature can act as a solution to the problem is true, but it's not sufficient. It is a necessary condition, but not a sufficient condition. So we have to have a rapid and ambitious targets towards reducing emissions in order to address the climate change side of the things, while fulfilling or enhancing or increasing biodiversity conservation commitments. If you look back what happened to HE target, that kind of modality going forward is not the solution. So we need to think differently. That's what the report also highlights as a part of solution. And it talks about potentially increasing the protected area coverage to 30 at the list. So the discussion is going on. Then in terms of agricultural system, increase sustainable agricultural system and forestry practices. At a certain extent, the solution lies on us as an individual to the whole global community. So we have to compromise to some degree. And I think our lifestyle and the pattern of the food habit we have may have contributed to some of these. And we may need to think and reflect on that as well. That's another aspect the report has highlighted. And going through these agricultural practices and other systems, we need to think through eliminating subsidies that are harmful to both biodiversity and climate change mitigation practices at local, regional to national level. So that's the other solution approach we need to think about. That's what I would mention here and stop there.
Thanks very much, Ram. Let me go to you, Michelle. The main recommendations from your perspective that this report makes. Ways forward.
Leslie and Ram, and building on Ram's point, and we do make this point in the final section of the report, that is all the things that Ram's talked about, we need to do, we need to be more ambitious than ever before, we need to think more innovatively than ever before, but really picking up on Ram's point about we need to live differently, and we target, we don't say it in so many words, but essentially what we're saying in the report is we need to challenge the dominant neoliberal worldview. We say, you know, need to think beyond economic approaches and seeing GDP as the only indicator of well-being, but really we need to target the key underlying values of what are key drivers, the underlying drivers, indirect drivers of both climate change and biodiversity loss. Question, what is it that is causing this unsustainable consumption and overproduction? So really looking at new paradigms, but often old paradigms. So Indigenous knowledges about how to live more sustainably, to live better lives in conjunction with nature. And another key point, in some ways I touched upon earlier, is yes, of course, we need to overhaul our legal and regulatory systems and create those within existing instruments, create those greater connections across sectors, but also importantly across scales, and making sure that a range of actors can be involved in this in this process in an equitable way as well. So I think something that the media has picked up on quite strongly is the need for climate and biodiversity to be tackled together. But importantly, and building on Shirmay's point at the beginning, importantly, issues of justice and equity need to be part and parcel of any solutions at the same time.
Thanks, Michelle. And going to you, Shumei, for you, what are the most other important ways forward that this report identifies?
I think for me, first and foremost is the need to really recognize the systems nature of this whole thing and adopt more integrated and systems approach in our governance across multiple interlinked sort of scales. And we know this really requires collaborating, across different networks, different actors, and within and beyond the specific administrative unit, and really taking into account the complex interlinkages across sectors and the cascading sort of impacts of any decisions that we might make. This is very often very challenging because it really requires a range of changes, including changed mental models of decision makers, and overcoming the institutional inertia of each and every of our institute. They have their own sort of inertia, and also we need to build the knowledge, capacity, and decision supporting tools that can support that kind of change. And also the need to overcome the spatial, temporal, and institutional scale mismatches at any given governmental level. For example, reducing the siloed approach in urban planning, management, and research, and adopting systems approach is something we have been really advocating for a long time. But despite this widely, cities being widely considered as being a unit or level of government, where these various policy goals can really come together rather naturally, or at least much easier way than their national counterpart. But most of our urban planning and management practices is still being siloed. Now, I would like to give you just one example of that. We all know that many Australian cities have this increased uptake of residential solar panels in, across the last decade also, which is a great trend in terms of climate mitigation, and actively, encouraged by cities and the state governments in light of their pursuit of 100% renewable or net zero carbon goals. However, most of these cities, urban, municipal government, their net zero energy goals or 100% renewable goals do not really consider where the end of life solar panels would really go. And currently, most of them are just ending up in landfills. And these because they belong to a different, governmental department. So, but if we consider the increasing waste streams from this rapidly increasing solar uptake and the embodied carbon in producing these solar panels, or the various potential impact on ecosystem of this landfill, it is really obvious for us to need to find a better solution for this, rather than just ignore them as belonging to different department. And the other point, I think Michelle already highlighted, I really stress that the just transition is really important, so that some of those people who are already disadvantaged aren't really further compromised in our rapid transformation, in our rush to address climate change and biodiversity conservation. And finally, I think this is from a more personal sort of perspective. I think a more integrated approach in our scientific practice as well. For example, more cross-domain interactions and collaborations such as this particular IPBES and IPCC, scientific finding report will be really important in terms of addressing our major common challenges going forward.
Thanks very much, Shumei. I'm going to go now to a few questions that have come into the chat box. And the first one is from Kirsty Davies. Hi, Kirsty. Lovely to hear from you and see you online. Firstly, she offers her congratulations to all of the authors of the report based on her own experience with IPBES, and notes that it's been a long time coming, which I think we can all agree with. And she was wondering exactly the same question as I wrote down earlier, which is where to now? How to best? There's a lot of reports out there. All of us have been involved in writing reports, many of which have sat on some dusty shelf in some office somewhere. So it's really important to get these really important messages out and change policy. Can I ask all of you even to comment on how best to do that? How do we close that gap between what is essentially, you know, a fairly academic document in many ways and action on the ground? So maybe Michelle, what would you like to take up that challenge first?
Well, I'll first start by acknowledging that Kirsty was one of the expert reviewers of this document. So thank you, Kirsty, both for the excellent question and for the excellent questions on the document itself. And part of the reason why we're gathered here today is directly talking to that process which Leslie has highlighted. So it's been really wonderful to see the range of participants that are online today from a range of different levels of government. That's part of the process. Many of us are also involved in getting the message out in through the media. So, and also there's a piece in the conversation that will be coming out either this week or early next week. So those are some of the new, the direct ways in which that's happening, but also in terms of IPBES and IPCC involvement at the negotiation level. So when the world was changing in March last year, the last time that everyone could come together to negotiate the post-2020 framework in Rome, IPBES had an important role as part, an advisory role as part of the negotiation process. And also recognizing the intergovernmental in the names of both these organizations, very much definitely at the national government level to convey those messages, as well as the other outreach work that we're doing.
Yes, just to pick up on that, it's certainly the case, I think, that this COP26 coming along in Glasgow, there's every indication that things like nature-based solutions are going to be a huge focus of that meeting. Shumei and Ram, do you have anything else to add to Michelle's ideas about how all of the important work in this report might be actually translated into real action? Because it's clear that real action is sorely needed. Shumei?
Yeah, I think I agree with Michelle that the fact that this is IPCC IPBES branded sort of workshop report, it does carry its own sort of weight and importance, especially for the policy makers. And I think this is really an effort from the scientific world trying to reach out and engage the policymakers actively. And I think I wouldn't be too, emphasize the role of single report because after all, we're all scientists, and our core endeavor is really producing new knowledge so that we can support any policy decisions. But I would also not really underestimate the role of this kind of report. For example, recently we have done it's still a work that is ongoing. We have surveyed several hundred of municipalities, try to see what actually prompted them to adopt this climate emergency declaration. And many of them actually specifically cited the IPCC 1.5 degree report, saying that has been one of the really spurring sort of force for them to take action. And in many of their city level, the climate emergency declaration, they actually specifically mentioned the role of this IPCC report. So in that sense, I'm cautiously optimistic in terms of how the findings from this report will be translated into policy.
Thanks, Shumei. Let's be cautiously optimistic, all of us. Ram, any further thoughts on this?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I think what I think personally is this type of reports have been published many times in many ways, but between the two significant bodies of the UN, for example. I use IPBES and IPCC. Being a joint work, it might have a weight in terms of how they will think going forward, designing, or whenever they are doing their assessment, trying to connect these dots together. So that is one of the way at the scientific level, it might have some bearing on it. And rightly, Leslie, you pointed out that the COP 15 of the CBD and COP 26 of the UNFCCC is going to happen this year, hopefully, and then there might be some discussion about this report. So this is at the scientific level, and then through governments, it has to come to the reality of individuals, and then they need to feel what they can do, or what sort of responsibility do they have. We all have some role to play here. So there is no single-pronged approach to solve these problems. From scientific community and governments at some level, higher level, to individuals, local councils, business communities, all have to come together to address this problem. So my hope is through awareness raising, I'm not saying we are not aware of this, the problem is quite known, but how it links to me as an individual, how it links to me as a family, how it links to my community where I live in. If we start to reflect from that point of view, then we can make changes, and then that change will carry forward. And I think that's the way forward in my view. Until and unless individuals are somehow convinced or incentivized to act in a particular direction, producing reports does not reflect into reality. So that's what I would say. Thank you.
Thanks, Ram. So our next question is from Nathaniel at ACF, which really follows on from Kirsty's, but with an Australian flavour. So he's asking whether any of the panellists know about how this sort of, whether there are plans ahead for a similar sort of report focused on the Australian situation. I would also throw in at this point a news item that came out last week with Australia being rated last in the latest Sustainable Development UN report. Last year we were second last, ahead of Brunei. Now we're last in terms of how well we are managing the Sustainable Development Goals, particularly on climate. So clearly in Australia, something like this is necessary. But are there any plans for more regional follow-ups of this type of global report? Maybe Michelle, if you know of any.
I don't know of any, but in some ways, Nathaniel, I see that as an invitation for collaboration, because as we've seen in the climate space and the idea of transnational approaches that we talked about earlier, we're increasingly moving beyond national governments. And in Australia, we have to move beyond national governments as being this force for change. So importantly, a lot of state governments are doing really important work, and also building on Ram's point about we need to connect to communities on the ground. So at the moment, I'm not aware of any processes for bringing this forward, but I really welcome that sort of question of going, how can we, and I really mean we in this very immediate sense, how can we build on that?
Thanks, Michelle. And that, in fact, sort of segues nicely into the next question, which is from Linda Wilson. So she's an early career researcher, and she's talking about how academia in particular and academic researchers need to be incentivized to work in an interdisciplinary manner, because obviously these huge, wicked challenges require interdisciplinary effort. Do any of you have, you all work in universities, do any of you have ideas? Maybe we could go to Shumei or Ram for this one, as to how to incentivize the necessary interdisciplinarity in the research area to tackle these sorts of issues. Shumei, you're smiling, I think you've got some thoughts.
Yes, I was just thinking this is indeed one of the really big challenge that is facing the academia. because we all know how the incentive system within universities work. You need to, really publish, you need to make contribution to your disciplinary development, and so on and so forth. And you need to be recognized by your immediate peer. And from my own experience, I think I would say it is in a way much easier to be recognized by your disciplinary sort of peer, rather than trying to make impact across discipline and interdisciplinary. So whoever trying to tackle the interdisciplinary sort of questions really faces multiple challenges, in terms of the difficulty of the issue itself. In many ways, you have to find your way, your conceptual framing, your even, building theories as you go, rather than, following a paved track of theoretical, trail, and then just advance a little bit. And trying to tackle interdisciplinary problems, very often you have to develop your own views. And that's one challenge, but at the same time, you also face the challenge of the difficulty of being recognized, of doing the same work, because you're talking to basically not to a specific community or society, but across different people. And in doing that, very often you're also stepping on the toes of somebody else. That's very easy thing to do. So I totally understand the challenge of doing interdisciplinary work, especially for early careers. But I think slowly, gradually, I think changes are in the horizon. For example, at ANU, we started to really emphasize what is the impact, what is the impact of your engagement, for example. So although I don't think we have developed a sort of perfect system of recognizing this kind of engagement and real world impact, but I think the recognition of the importance is started to show up in the university system. So hopefully in not so far away future, we can have a bit more encouraging sort of incentive system in place in our university sector, so that we can encourage early career scientists to take this sort of pathways.
Thanks, Shumei. Look, we've got a couple more questions and only 3 minutes remaining. So I think Rachel Clark's question, Rachel, I think addressing that specifically to RAM maybe offline might be a way to go. And I think there's probably something in the report about the challenge of carbon sinks in a warming climate. So I'll go to Harry's question, and really to sort of, because I think it's a nice way to finish off, which is really how the panel would tackle at least the perceived apathy from our own Australian government in these matters. If you had one, let's finish off by asking you, if you had one message for the Australian government that you would like them to take home about this issue, what would it be? Let me start with you, Ram. What would you like to tell the Prime Minister?
Okay, difficult question.
Let me, by the way, everybody.
Let me try to frame it as, let's think as an individual, whether the current environmental challenges are affecting us as an individual or not, and think from that lens and act accordingly. You don't need to think as a government or any bureaucrats or at any level, but think at an individual. If you feel you are affected by the current environmental challenges, try how you can address it. I think I would like to convey the same message to the government of different levels. Thanks,
Ram. Shumei, what would you like to tell the government?
Well, again, it's difficult and sensitive question, but probably the one message would be really read some of these scientific findings and not, turn a blind eye towards it. And I think more importantly, I would say I would like to innovate, bypass the national government and really make a call to subnational government. Really don't wait until the national government to instigate a particular policy or anything. Just, start from taking action from whatever you can do. And in the world, many, city governments, subnational government are doing great things. And I think many Australian cities as well. So I would really encourage the subnational government to really, step up and then take action And that in a way can force the national government to follow and take action as well.
Thanks, Shumei. And Michelle, you can have the final word. What would be your message?
I might build on both Ram and Shumei's points in terms of individuals are voters, and state governments should and will take up the challenge, and people care. There's votes in this, and it's important, even if the government, it's in the government's self-interest to take action on these critical issues for humanity.
Thanks, Michelle. I think that's a wonderful way to end. Look, I know you can't applaud openly, everybody online, except with little yellow hands. I'd just like to thank all three of our terrific authors and panelists for their time today. I really hope that this really important report is taken up. We all hope it has impact. There's no more important issue, in my view, than the issues tackled in it. And let's all keep helping to create that impact out in our society more generally. So thank you to our panelists. Thank you to everybody online. And please, if you haven't read the report yet, download yourselves a copy today. Thank you and goodbye.